the teachers there was women, and they want to share many things like the Japanese culture. But
thank you so much. Welcome back to the panel that we have all been waiting for. We're talking about ethics. We're talking about cybersecurity. We're talking about how you can secure these AI algorithms. How do we secure our corporates as we deploy these technologies? Remember, when we deploy these technologies, we also become vulnerable to cybersecurity risks and so on. But there are also some biases that are inherent in these technologies and so on. How do we handle them? My task is very simple here, is to introduce our panel moderator, and then I will hand over to her, and that is Nyari Samushonga. And Nyari is the CEO for WeThinkCode. Nyari, I will hand over to you and the team, and have a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Zenzele. Really excited to be here. And excited by the panel. We've got a very wide range of perspectives represented. So I think what I'll do is I'll just give the panelists an opportunity to each introduce themselves so that the audience has context on what their background is as they give input to the issue of data privacy, data security, and ethical AI. So Anand, I know you were just speaking. I'll start with you. Could you just take a moment to introduce yourself in case some of the audience have just joined?
Sure, I would. So everyone out there, my name is Anand Tamboli, and I'm an author. I'm a professional speaker, and I'm a futurist. I help people to bring their ideas, strategies, and visions in reality. And while doing so, I help them build a better business, a sustainable business. I often speak on innovation, futures literacy, and technology, and I help people to join the dots that they don't see.
Thank you very much, Anand. I hope we uncover some of these dots and get to talk about them during the course of the panel. Lavina, you're up next. Please just let our audience know a little bit about you.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. So for me, it's been very much baselined against the three-pronged approach, which has been fundamentals of economics, fundamentals of psychology, and fundamentals of technology. So very much multidisciplinary. I have been very much a voice for Africa when it comes to AI and blockchain and emerging tech. I have been the voice for Africa when it comes to the European Union for artificial intelligence. I am co-authoring a book at the moment as well in terms of virtual reality or augmented reality. Together with an organization called the MKAI, which is based in the UK, and being very much nominated a woman in terms of the space as a leader when it comes to leadership.
Thank you very much, Lavina. I think this is going to be interesting as we delve into what is the context of this as Africa becomes more connected to a global world, what's unique to us versus what is universal. Paul, can I hand the mic to you?
Yes, thanks. I'm Paul Whelpton. I'm the Chief Information and Analytics Officer of JUMO World. At JUMO, we focus on leveraging AI and machine learning to bring financial access to the previously excluded markets in Africa. We're very proud to be one of the biggest, or if not the biggest, financial inclusion player on the continent, with more than 18 million customers and $3 billion served over the last few years, and very passionate about how we interpret information from some of these previously excluded segments of the world, and to remove biases to give access to financial services to everyone.
Great. So as we drive for inclusion, what are we gaining and what are we giving up? I think that's going to be interesting to delve into from your perspective. Dr. Ansgar, can I hand over to you?
Sure, thank you very much. And it's great to be on this panel. My name is Ansgar Koene. I'm the Global AI Ethics and Regulatory Leader at EY. So I help the firm with our internal governance structures around AI, our engagement with clients, both in the audit and the consulting kind of space. But a large part of the work that I'm doing is engaging with the policy developments in this space. So typically that involves the OECD, the EU, and global the global developments around how these regulations are being developed. I'm also a advisor to Afro Leadership, an NGO based in Cameroon, and that is also branching out into neighboring countries. And I have a long career in academic research, where we've been doing some studies around the impact that digital technologies are having on society.
Okay. Thank you for your intro, and it will be great to hear the view from academia coming into business, and also to compare our soon-to-be live Poppy Act to the world-famed GDPR and see how does it compare, and are we meeting the world standards. But without further ado, I think I'll just dive into the questions and go around the panel to get some insights. Starting out with data privacy, I think the big question that comes to mind for me here is about the sovereignty of data. Who actually owns our data? So as we are becoming more interconnected, as this data that enables the power of AI to be unleashed is gathered, whose is it? Does a person's data actually belong to them? Or does it belong to the corporations that give us these mobile applications and things we click on that make the data? Ansgar, can I start with you on that one?
Sure. I think this is a very important question. Who owns it? But what do we mean with owning data? Who can use it? How can we actually control the way in which it's being used? Often the concern that people have isn't so much with the fact that the data is being used, but with the fact that the data is being used in ways different than what they had expected. You shared the data on a certain platform, understanding for a particular use, but then it gets repurposed for something that you hadn't expected, and that is where people become concerned. I think an additional dimension that is becoming increasingly important is also the idea of community data, not just an individual or the company that you're interacting with or the government that you're interacting with, but also community around it. A clear example of that, for instance, is genetic data. If genetic data about myself is also data about my brother, about the rest of my direct family, and those kinds of things. So these are, I think, important issues that need to be clarified.
Okay. Paul, I'm going to bat it to you. So Ansgar's view is that as we give the data, we have a particular intention. JUMO is making financial transacting easier. You're taking this data and we intend to reduce the friction of our transacting. How do you draw the line in terms of when we give you that data to transact easier, where does it go? Who uses it next? And is that okay?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'd really like to use Ansgar on that. I think our world, where the complexity really comes into place when we talk data privacy and ownership, is monetizing data. We live and work in a very complex ecosystem where a lot of data, where there's a lot of data obviously moving around. So if you think about a telco provider, they store billions of rows of data at their own cost, right? And some of that is for regulatory purposes, but some of that they would use or with the intention to eventually monetize. Same thing with any sort of financial institution like a bank. And then obviously the customer is the one generating the data. So from a true ownership perspective, that's someone that's actually transacting and generating, and then giving you permission to store and use that information. So we really believe that all parties should be able to gain some sort of monetization or value for the role they play in that. I think the big issue that we've seen from a data privacy perspective is that it's usually the person generating the data, the consumer, that gets the least amount of that value being shared. And that's something we really want to change on the continent, because you can have commercial commitments between different parties on how you sell or use data or to kind of generate profit. But the end user, as an individual entity, never gets benefit into that monetization. So for us, it's about firstly being clear, and I agree with Ansgar, this is what your data is being stored for and the purpose of use, but making sure that there's financial or monetization value linked to that consumer, whether that be really good product So making sure that someone gets cheaper products if they're kind of willing to share information with someone, and making sure that that information is not just seen as a batch process that's owned by an entity, but that the customer can actually get that value.
Okay, thank you very much. Anand, keen to get your perspective. Do you want to jump into this one? So there's the commercial value of data that emanates from this. And as the user, it originated with you. And Paul is sharing the view that you should actually get some of the benefit of that. What's your view around this commercialization and monetization of data once it's shared with consent?
Now, there are two things I think we have to look at as a consumers or as a customer. There are two types of data. One is truly your data, like data about you, your name, age, sex, other preferences, etc. That's directly given by you. And I think, again, the terms and conditions aside, because a lot of those conditions are buried in that we could use this data for some other purpose, as you asked earlier. So that definitely is one that it should be intended for what you agreed or signed on for. But there is a second kind of data I want you to pay attention to, and which is a huge data, by the way. It's called as a data about you, the metadata. So for example, if you go to a supermarket and you're at the shelf looking at 10 different toothpastes, and you have a look at them and you purchase one, cameras are watching you. They know how you made that decision in a way. Now, if that profile, that information is there, that's not your data. So in a way, for most companies, most corporations, that data is more important than a little teeny beeny details about individual. They want more on a profiling information, and that data unfortunately doesn't belong to you. So that's where I think the lines get blurred as to where does that stop? Where does your ownership stop? And then how do you deal with that? Because you haven't signed up for that part.
Oh, that's definitely interesting. Lavina, I'm going to bring it to you, and I'd definitely like to hear from Paul and Ansgar as well on this matter of, well, not all the data actually belongs to you just because it's about you. So, but Lavina, please share your views.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the hardcore ethical questions, we like to believe as humanity that, whatever concerns us belongs to us. And we want to have control over that. So, given that mindset of an end consumer versus corporates who's very much about, how can we increase and monetize around the sector. And then you have governments who are saying, well, we've got to bring in some kind of regulation somewhere along the line. So I think it's very much a thin line that we need to walk until we actually understand the sector a lot more. We obviously have known prior examples of tech industries or tech companies that have gone wrong and have failed us in the space. But equally, we have not highlighted enough those tech companies that have done right by an end consumer. So again, it is, I think, for a consumer or for an ordinary citizen, because we talk about digital citizenry. So in terms of that, it has to be very much be empowered, be completely aware, and know what your rights are, right? And if you don't have any rights, start voicing your opinion to have those rights. Okay, so start getting more control of your data, whether or not it is parts of the data or complete. I think those are, very much comes at the next level, right, of the conversation.
Right.
For now, it's very much about empowering yourself. And I think for organizations, we need to really look back, take a step and say, okay, from a social ethical perspective, what exactly are we wanting to gain? What is our end result? What is our end goal? How is it going to be beneficial to our end consumer? So look at our own entities. I know that there was a company recently that actually did a self-audit in terms of their ethical audit processes. So are we brave enough as corporates to be able to actually do that, look internally and have somebody shine a light and say, these are the areas where you ethically need to improve, right? Whether it be from a data perspective, whether it be from an algorithmic creation perspective, or whether it be from just purely an AI strategy perspective, right? And then you have the third view, which is obviously around the government. And a lot can obviously be done in the sector. We know this. We know the gap is largening between the tech innovation space as well as regulation, right? That whole curve is exponentially growing. So we've got to find ways to bridge it. And how do we start doing that? We start doing that by, having these little communities, voicing our opinions, getting greater minds to come together, so that nobody falls through the cracks. And especially given the African context, I think we have a lot of vulnerability for a lot to fall through the cracks.
Okay. So I think you touched on a few things there, Lavina, that I'm going to come back to. Among them, the ethics, the policy play, what does governance do in this space, as well as the level of education and information that the consumer has. But I still want to poke the bear a little bit and ask Paul or Ansgar to jump in to Anand's comment about just because we're talking about you doesn't mean we're talking to you. So yes,
I'm happy to jump in there.
Yours.
Anand, I think it's a very interesting comment that you have there. I think I'm going to use an example that we see quite often in the financial world, which I think kind of contradicts that view a little bit. So we truly believe that a customer should have influence on, even if it's data about you, if that's going to be used in any way, because the level of bias that could be created from some of that information without you knowing what it's going to be used for becomes quite dangerous. So the simplest example for me is a credit bureau that is only lobbied by a regulator and have no direct interaction with the customer. So in the African markets where we are, they are very prone to like loan sharks or predatory lending. So in my opinion, if someone offers someone a $5 or $10 loan and charges them 55% interest, that is a fault of the company giving that product, right? That information is by law and by the regulator. You have to share that to a central bureau. It's data about you. So let's say it's data about Anand, and that creates a significant bias in that person's financial kind of future. So defaulting on that loan, no one would look at the product and saying, look, the product might have been misfit. Anand is actually now blacklisted and he can't get access to future financial services going forward. And that's pure data about you that with the wrong lens is kind of shared. So I think it's an interesting debate, because there's obviously some examples like the one you said with people doing consumer research where you can't know everything that everyone is seeing about you. But I think I'm quite a firm believer that if any decision is being made, that you should be able to participate in that and have the ability to say yes or no. Imagine if you could block any financial institution from looking at your credit bureau information because you have to. There's something going on there, right? So you've been either hacked, someone fraudulently did that, or there's a product dispute where someone actually got it wrong. That would be much more powerful than forcing industries to just pop that into a central database where everyone is monetizing that information. A financial institution is monetizing it. The credit bureau is monetizing it for every kind of transaction. But at the end of the day, the consumer creates quite a lot of bias. So I think that's a very real example in our world where we see data about us becoming quite dangerous.
Okay, so not all data about us is entirely neutral. So it might seem it depends. The traditional consulting answer, it depends. Ansgar, I see you wanted to give some input there.
Yes. So first of all, the example that Paul brought up is it's a very good example, and it points to the fact that certain types of data that maybe aren't the data that itself identifies you is still personal data, in the sense that it is very much connected to you and it's going to have impacts on you. But I think another aspect is, of course, data that you as an individual are producing, but which sort of is more in the kind of scenario that Anand described, data that actually goes into a general understanding of this is how people or people of your type are behaving, but it's not actually being used specifically to profile you to do something directly about you as such. And I think people are generally okay with that kind of data being used. What they are more concerned about there, I think, and which goes also to the question about the ethics issues around the data usage, is this data then going to be used to identify certain weaknesses of this kind of population group that you happen to be in order to better manipulate you? It's the question about, is this data going to lead to a loss of agency or something like that, that I as a person have? And so in that way, it connects very strong to the ethical concerns that people have about how data is being used. Is this data effectively trying to extract information about me as a person, about my weaknesses or something like that, in order to provide an advantage to someone else that is going to not be a mutual kind of benefit for both of us?
Okay, so this is an interesting one, and I'll use that to segue into the conversation about data security. So an individual does opt in, and the platform, the organization, the application that gathers this information where the individual consents, they consent to particular things. But once they consent, is that information safe? I know more recently there have been more and more hacks that have taken place that relate to data security. And so now I did consent for a particular purpose, but I remain vulnerable to the extent that where that information is stored, even as that provider has the good intention of adhering to what we agreed, only valuable to the extent that it is safe. And so my question next is, and I'll start with Anand, is what's your view? Are the providers of these services that are online doing enough to protect our data so that when there is a mutual agreement and understanding about where it will go, how it will be used, some external party doesn't dive in there and suddenly know more things about me than I ever needed them to?
Yeah. I think here applying some of the best practices, or more than best practices, I should say, some of the standard practices comes into play. For example, in banking cases in particular, I worked with almost half a dozen banks, and so they are governed by a central, like a reserve bank of a particular country. So there are certain minimum standards they need to maintain in terms of the security. Like you can have more than that, but the minimum is there. If you don't have that, then it is the problem. Like think about you leaving your house without locking and someone comes in. Is that your problem, or is that that police should take care of it? But if you locked your house, you did your part, and then someone breaks in, then should police take care of it? So that's where I think it comes down to that. If we have those minimum standards in place, that how user data should be treated, how it should be kept safe, encrypted, and what kind of measures should be taken, that should be the comparison point where you say whether somebody had, whether there was a lapse or there wasn't any. At the moment, for a lot of unregulated sector, like you could have medical data going through HIPAA compliance and number of other things. You could have banking data going through other compliances, but not all the sectors have these kind of compliance regulations, etc. So that's where I think we'll see more challenges.
You raise an interesting point around the sector having regulations, and an interesting thought comes to mind that I'd like to throw out there, which is we've seen with the increased focus on climate change that our appliances now come with indications of how they consume energy. When you buy a vehicle, there's more interesting tagging that lets you know what its emissions are going to be. And as a conscious consumer, you can actually opt into or out of a particular washing machine based on this information. Should we be tagging providers of data and saying, this is a 5-star data privacy and security compliance company, whereas this one is kind of high risk here? Ansgar?
So I think that's an interesting idea. The challenge is to the extent to which people will be able to both access these kinds of marks of security, cybersecurity quality, will have the actual ability to choose an alternative. If they're seeing that this one has a bad cybersecurity record, is there a better one that I can choose? Because if there isn't, then that in itself doesn't really help me. I think one of the interesting things that you raised with the putting energy trackers and those kinds of things on devices is also the question, okay, it's very interesting potentially to collect this data, but do we need to be sending this data to the cloud and to other places? Or should it be sufficient for that data to be processed on my device and never to go to the internet, and that way being much more secure? Or potentially the only pieces of information it sends is a very occasional accumulated piece of data that is the actual relevant one when it comes to the environmental impact, as opposed to the minute by minute measure of the electricity, which could, when hacked, actually tell people, oh, you tend to not be at home during these and these times, so therefore I could break into your house during that time. Those kinds of questions. With how much information do we really need to be streaming and putting into centralized databases where they can be potentially vulnerable? Final point, connecting the data security with the data privacy thing is elements that we have, for instance, in the GDPR around the data purpose minimization, but also the fact that data, once it has performed this purpose and is no longer relevant to this company, should be removed and therefore no longer be available for somebody who hacks. Plus, of course, the fact that under GDPR, if you are hacked as a company and private data is leaked, you have an obligation to notify, which is often not the case when there isn't a law that forces you to do so.
I love that input, because one of the points you're actually making is that the safest way to be is to not have the data lying around anyway. And so if it doesn't need to be there, don't put it out there at all, and only have exposed what actually needs to be out in the world. Paul, keen to hear your views on this part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think this is a very difficult one, because obviously I think we all would agree that data security is absolute paramount, but it's very difficult for the consumer to know that all of the data that you're generating and that's being stored is in a safe space. And even if there was an opt-in to say, look, only store my data when I'm comfortable, to get your head around as not a cybersecurity expert, that is this database good or not? I think that the second one, which I think Anand touched on a little bit, is like, whose responsibility is it to make sure that it's safe, so that you're not firstly generating the data that you're not comfortable with, but also if someone is taking the responsibility for storing it, like what is the compensation that if it's not stored well? I think banks do it quite well, in the sense that it's very well governed, and if there's a data breach that financially impacts you, that obviously becomes it's a very simple process where you get refunded for whatever kind of financial breach there was. But there's quite a few edge cases, like the one Ansgar just said about someone breaking into your house because of a data storage breach, which is very difficult to trace back. And when it becomes something that's non-financial, so even a break-in could be non-financial, but when it becomes reputational, as an example, very difficult for someone to do. So like a controversial one from a few years ago, I don't know if you guys remember the Ashley Madison case, which was a big social website where people logged in to basically have affairs. So married couples having affairs on Ashley Madison. And that data got breached and obviously destroyed thousands and thousands, I think it was millions of families with that kind of data being there. And it got, like, from an ethical perspective, a thumbs up from the whole world, saying, like, you want to expose this kind of data, like, that's not there's nothing you can do. But can you imagine the reputational damage that could go with some of that, people losing jobs, families, and how it goes? So I think it's a difficult one to say, can you get people to opt in, to take the risk by themselves, to say you need to know enough to say, yes, I'm willing to. So if I want my fridge to go into the cloud, I at least know that it is protected by the right cybersecurity kind of governance. And do I actually, like, am I willing for some of this information to take the risk on myself? So where companies actually say this risk is yours, because if we get hacked, this could be used in a different way. That's not just financial compensation.
I think this is really interesting, because something that then keeps coming up is this construct of the role of governance. And I think we should go straight to that, which is policy. And Ansgar, talk to us a little bit about GDPR and why this is a good idea. Should we just all copy and paste it and throw out POPI in South Africa? What are its strengths and limitations from your experience?
So I think it's often very tempting to just copy paste somebody else's piece of regulation, because in a sense, well, if they're already using it, obviously it has already gone through a process, and various things have already worked out. The challenge is that, of course, GDPR and any other kind of piece of regulation does not live in a vacuum. It lives in together with other pieces of regulation that exist in that space. And so you need to be careful to make sure that you aren't creating gaps if you are only importing one particular piece of regulation. Now, as far as the sort of the experience with GDPR is concerned, I think it has been, like in any kind of regulation, slightly a mixed bag. On the whole, I would say it has been a positive experience in the sense that people have a much clearer sense of what their rights are, and the companies also have an easier way of making sure that they are compliant across the continent or the EU. The challenge has been, as far as the implementation is concerned, really on the data protection authorities, making sure that they have enough resources to really make sure that this is being implemented the right way. It's also been in the courts and making sure that the judicial system actually understands the details of this kind of a technical piece of legislation. And there have been cases where there's been challenges with having the judge recognize the ins and outs of what actually applies. But the general consensus is that this is the right kind of direction to be going in. Obviously, the extraterritoriality is challenging, in the sense that if every country is going to be introducing extraterritorial operating legislations, then how are we ever going to know as a company which one we need to be compliant with everywhere? On the other hand, given this digital space being inherently something that is going across borders, it is difficult to see how to truly have an effective piece of legislation if you cannot reach across the board. So a bit of a mixed bag. On the whole, I think it is it has set a very important precedent, and we see that many countries outside of the EU are looking at it as a basis for how to shape their own legislation.
Great. Paul, you're operating in multiple territories, and so I think Ansgar's just opened this up to the complexity that outside of the implementation complexity in a single territory of a particular legislation to try and protect data, there's the fact that you're transacting across different territories. How are you dealing it within that JUMO space?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult. I think it becomes very, especially if you have regulators that kind of make some of these decisions in a vacuum. I think it's sometimes the purpose of regulation kind of outweighs what we actually wanted to do if you see the impact on the economy. So we definitely deal with that. Like we've been lucky that we've been managing across all of our different integrations. So we do integrations in some of the most secure countries, like Pakistan. No data is allowed to leave there. I think our approach has been to make contact with the regulators directly before entering any market and making sure we help set the policy and understand where those limitations are and what the use is. But it's definitely a challenge. I think listening to some of these conversations and also looking at the chat, there's been some very interesting comments in the chat that people have made. It's like, where do you draw the line? Like, where does it become no data at all? And can you actually? I mean, there's real serious commercial applications where you can take down industries if you take this too hard. If the whole world decided it's a version of GDPR, but we are more stringent because we don't want there to be unintended consequences, like you could bring Facebook to their knees, right? There will be nothing for them to kind of do. So it is quite a difficult one to know where that is. I think our approach has just been you have to help set policy and make sure that the context is understood. But I think it's going to be a challenge for organizations that want to use and leverage data in the future, especially as we start following some of these kind of early movers. GDPR is a great example of that. It's influencing Africa for sure. We've seen East Africa specifically focusing very much on what's happening in Europe.
That's great. Thank you. Lavina, I know you're having some connectivity, but want to give you an opportunity to speak to this as we then dive into the last part and some questions going into the AI piece. But on data security, your thoughts? I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, data security, absolutely crucial sector. I think, we sit with, many conundrums, one being, the likes of GDPR, which has been implemented, or NDPR, or POPI in our case, throughout Africa. Out of the 54 countries, we're only sitting with 6 that have actually adopted some form of data privacy. So there's a lot of work that actually still needs to be done in this space. As much as we talk about the evolution of us holding our own data because we are that walking asset in essence, I still think there's, great room for improvement on all fronts. I think data is something, data privacy as such is something that we need to not just take lightly and turn our backs towards.
Okay. Thank you for that. And so I'm just going to go into the last section before we open it up for questions. I think I'm taking liberties with the clock because we started late. So Zenzel, if you're out there, just smack me on the wrist if I'm entirely out of order. But where I'll begin with is artificial intelligence. How intelligent is this machine really? And we've seen a lot of information come out on the bias of AI, and it speaks to which data is collected, which data is used to train the machine, and the human at the center of all these big ideas, consciously or unconsciously, has their own biases, agendas, and intentions. So opening it up in a very broad way, the benefits of AI versus the problems around initially just the representation issue in the data that is being used to train these machines. Can I start with Anand?
Why not? So I think a picture would be painted that problems are not as many as the benefits are. And prima facie, it looks good that, yeah, every technology has problems. So why should this be any different? The only issue I have, or I keep evangelizing about, is any technology, particularly a kind of AI, is a very big amplifier. So it's, I would say it's very reckless to even ignore a smaller mistake because you're just going to amplify it a million times. It's very different than a small, typical old school technology where one problem goes to scale of 10 versus AI where one problem goes to scale of thousands or even millions. So from that perspective, I think we cannot use the same rhetoric that, oh, it has happened before, so why is the problem now? This is different. We have to be treating it differently, and we have to be very, very careful with what we do. Bias, biggest issue, but it has to be treated seriously before you could even solve it.
Lavina, can I pull you in? Because I'm keen to hear more of your voice. We missed it there for a sec.
Yeah, sure. What in particular would you like me to address?
On this matter of, Anand is pointing out that the scale, we've had issues with technology before where you had a glitch in one place. When Google has a glitch, essentially the entire interconnected world is in trouble. And so when you speak to it in the context of AI, that the game has changed in a big way. We are now making decisions off of a machine that have an impact that is just at a scale that's, I think, in many ways difficult to even conceive of. What is your view of the impact of bias in data that's used to train machines, and the views out there about how important these bias issues are? Are we overreacting?
Yeah, I certainly don't think we're overreacting, not at this point. In terms of how far down the pipeline we are, I think a lot of awareness has been raised. So people are starting to sit back and ask themselves the questions. But are we asking the right kind of questions, right? Are we asking the right kind of understanding? Do we have the right kind of definitions? What I see as AI ethics could be very different to how you see it. So there's certain common blocks, as you wish, that seem to be missing in this chain of understanding, right? Before we could actually progress to the next. However, when it comes to ethics as a whole, I think it's something that we need to eat, breathe, and sleep in every organization. It needs to be part of that entire spectrum of everything that you do. So be it as us as humans, right? And I guess this is where the someone could actually go as far fetched and saying, we've had rights and we've had knowing what's right and what's wrong for a very long time. We inherently know this, yet we still go and divert to doing the incorrect things. So why is it that this phase of AI is so different? For me in particular, it's very much baselined around are we actually trying to duplicate the human consciousness and our human behaviors? Is that the end goal of AI? Like many products, that may have been the intention when it came about or at the start of it. But like many other products, the intention of the creation is not necessarily how it ends up being utilized. So, for us, it should be fulfilling those needs and fulfilling those gaps to enhance humanity, right? And enhance that entire social impact that we're trying to get to.
Can I make a comment on that one, Nyari? Because I think that's such an interesting one. I hear this question quite a lot about the ethics and the bias that could create in AI, and I can completely agree that it should be to make the world a better place, like to enhance what we want. But I think that's quite sometimes a naive view, because we think of AI being this thing that could be turned into evil, but that's actually all business, right? It's the intent behind what we use technology for, which sometimes get quite bad. So I'm going to use a very simple example: insurance. I think the intent of insurance is to get as much premiums from, and sorry if I offend any insurance people on this call, but to get as much premiums from our users with paying out as little as possible. So that intent, whether you use AI or not, is a business model that drives profit. I would argue it's not seen in the world as being very unethical, because it's a business practice that's been existing for years. But you can use AI in a very good way, in a very efficient way to create a bigger problem. So I was on a panel with someone, I won't disclose the name of the company, but they won an AI award for being one of the best predictive companies in the world. And basically what they managed to do is track all of the data you can possibly imagine on flights and create the best short-term insurance product for flight delays, which is great, right? So is that ethical? Yes. Is it data that's public available? Yeah, probably is. It's flight data. We're not going to do any harm. But the intent behind it, whether it was AI or just normal insurance, is what really shocked me, because the implementation of that was to say the probability of a flight, so the lowest probability of there being a delay, offer all these people insurance. If there's a high probability of this flight being delayed because we have all the information now, don't offer this product, right? And that to me is something that AI is maybe exposing, but that's not a new risk. That risk in the insurance industry, and I'm using one industry as an example, has existed for the last 100 years. It's just being amplified by AI. So I think that's a ethical question that we need to think about. It's like there's still a human, there's still a company, there's still intent behind how you use it. And I think AI by itself is maybe just amplifying the problem and scaling it, but not necessarily making it much worse.
Yeah, so I think what Paul is pointing out here is really the AI ethics discussion has multiple facets to it. One of them being the one about, do we have the right kind of data, and is the system actually performing the way that we intended it to do? So things like bias because the data isn't sufficiently representative. But the other dimension is really, is this even something that we should be doing? Is this kind of an application of an AI technology something that should be doing? If we think, for instance, about the various states in the US that have now passed laws to ban the use of face recognition by law enforcement, this is not purely because the face recognition technology has difficulties with recognizing certain types of faces. It is simply because the community who is primarily being exposed to the use of this technology are fed up with over policing and this kind of use. And so really, even if the technology we're using were perfect, they would not want it to be there. So, and that's also why in the kind of discussions around AI ethics, I think a large part that, as any kind of company we're thinking about AI ethics needs to be doing, is to really think about this. This is part of our business ethics. We can't be talking about an ethics review board for AI separate from an ethics review of how we as a company are operating. And this is also sort of core of the kind of work that I'm involved with the IEEE, one of the global standards development organizations, on developing a standard for algorithmic bias considerations, is to say we need to think about this holistically throughout the process of developing and deploying of the system. And it starts with a conceptualization of what it is that you want to be doing with this piece of technology. Are we understanding the stakeholders who are going to be impacted by this in the right kind of way, or is even the formulation of the problem already biased? And then it goes into the questions about how did we choose what kind of data to collect? How did we choose what kind of an optimization criteria to choose for the algorithm? And how did we do the evaluation, etc.? So it is really important to keep in mind that, yes, the data is an important element to this, but it's not the only one. Just as a final point, why is AI actually triggering a lot of these discussions, even though we've been automating decision making at certain kind of scale for a long time before the so-called AI. I mean, we don't even have a clear definition of AI. Is a regression algorithm, is that AI or not? But a big part of this is that we are using machine learning, which is fundamentally driven by statistics. It is using statistics to extract patterns in the data in order to be able to find potential ways of doing predictions that wouldn't have been clear to a human to do. But that means it is inherently a black box, because we're using it because it wasn't easy for a human to understand the process. And now, after it has found some kind of a relationship, we want it to explain that to us. So that is an inherent kind of challenge that comes from the statistical approach. And then if we are looking at things like application in law enforcement being a hugely problematic space, is it fundamentally compatible with the idea of how law should operate? That law should be treating every potential a suspect as an individual and treating them as an individual, as opposed to as a statistical pattern.
Thank you so much for that, Ansgar. I think it resonates with a question that one of our listeners has put in, which is that I think one of the biases caused by AI is the fact that other professionals, such as psychologists, etc., are ignored during the development phase of AI algorithms. So this view that the intent of what we're trying to do and unpacking it from very different perspectives is left out, and then it's deemed to be this magical, objective, futuristic, statistical outcome. Anand, you were about to share something?
Yeah, so in fact, I would put a different spin on it as to when we talk about ethical problems, or when we say that we don't like something that AI is doing or system is doing, why does that happen? And it used to happen before, and why did we like then and not now? So there is a concept that you might know. It's called an information asymmetry. For example, you go to a bank branch or you go to a shop, a shopkeeper probably knows a little bit more about you than you know about them. So they have got a leverage to sell you something. And we kind of understand that when somebody has leverage in negotiation or other acts as such, and everybody understands that there is always a little bit of up and down. But when that up and down, which is at a human scale, gets amplified by AI, where the asymmetry, information asymmetry goes yay big, you feel threatened. You feel that now I'm in no position to win this. Even before you start, you feel that I have lost it. I have no control. I cannot fight it. These people, such as banks or big corporations, now are going to basically just take out my agency in a way to make any decision. And that's where I think these questions starts to come in, that is it ethical or not? But if by any means you make that asymmetry, and which is where the data comes in, because the asymmetry is because of hoarding of data on one side, while there is no data on the other side. Like you don't know nothing about the bank, but bank knows everything about you, or every other company as such. If that asymmetry goes, I think the ethical questions will start to diminish.
I think Jay has resonance with you. He's just put in the chat, the only way to have models provide reliable human-centered results is to have a social science construct guide the model ensemble and contextual bandits to continuously test through exploration and exploitation approaches. So I think we're all violently agreeing that there's two sides to this story. One of it is the statistical issue of what was the data. Another one is a human intent issue of where were we looking to go and who were the voices that sat at that table in making the decisions and what was their intention. I think just to wrap it up, I'm just going to give each of the panelists a last word to share regarding the broader context of data security, the ethics of it, its ownership, and how it's being used in artificial intelligence. So just parting words and thoughts, and I'll start with Anand and then take from there.
All right, thank you. So I think I'll go down to a very practical level, because at times we just tend to talk too much at a high level that nobody can do anything about it individually. But let's go at practical level, and I'll give you all the audience 3 pointers to. So when you go home, when you go back to your work, you can at least follow some of those. The number one is, as a consumer, as a customer, raise your self-awareness. When we say they know more about me than I know more about yourself. Self-awareness is the key, because that's when your decision-making is in your control. You don't lose the agency. Apply any method that you want. Number two, for corporations, and I mentioned this in my speech before, that more and more newer generation is now seeing that ethical corporations, or corporations with the purpose, the customer and the societal centricity, they are getting more advantage. People want to work with them. So how do you show that? How do you work on that is the key. Number three, I did mention about a practical method to test your solutions where you could avoid potential damage, unintended consequences. So it's a very practical method. Spend some time on it, apply it. I think it will put you on a right path. It doesn't hold all the answers, but it definitely gives you a direction.
Thank you. Ansgar, I'll come to you.
I think one thing to reflect on is this combination that we had today, personal data, data security, and AI issues. They are all intimately connected with each other. And also, if we look at something like the AI ethics principles that are being published by, there's like 100 sets of them out there now. But for instance, the OECD one or the EU ones, if you actually look at them around human-centric, transparent, accountable, these aren't really specifically AI issues. They apply equally to the use of data. They apply equally to basically any kind of use of technology. So really reflect on those and make sure that as an organization, you are actually implementing these principles, be it reflecting to AI or any other part of the organization.
Thank you. And then Lavina, your parting thoughts around the subject matter for the day?
Yeah, I'd pick up on what Dr. said in terms of accountability. I think the human perspective, we've had so many injustices, even gender biasness, who's been around since the beginning of time. So, each one of us needs to take some form of accountability, whether that's within our own space or within our corporate spaces, or, when we're creating algorithms, or when we just labeling data, right? It kind of needs to span across the board. We are at a point where, we need to do that inner reflection as much as we need to hold other people accountable for it.
Thank you. And Paul, ending up with you?
Cool, thanks. I think most people on this conference are data professionals, or at least interested in it. So I think for me, for all of us to think about is, I think the two issues that we spoke firstly about, so data security and data privacy, I think this is a field we're not sure where it's going to go, right? It could completely shut down and data could not be shared at all, or we could find an ethical way to do this. And whether that is storing it safely, like that's going to be something that pans out over time. I think one thing that for me that I'm passionate about is making sure that we create shared value with this data. So Michael Porter, like everyone that's done Economics 101, remember Porter's 5 forces. I think Michael Porter's latest really most famous work after that was creating shared value. And I'm like, maybe redeem myself a little bit for hitting on the insurance companies. But Discovery actually won the world awards for being one of the best examples of creating shared value, where they use information by incentivizing people, obviously, to be more healthy, to get points back, but that actually paid back to the customer. So not only in financial terms, but actually made people live longer and be more healthy. So I think if we can start with that intent as data leaders and say, if we use AI responsibly to create shared value, which means all parties participating in either storing, creating, or leveraging this data gets equal benefit, or at least some benefit, I think the other two things go away. Like people worrying about data privacy goes away if you don't have that massive fear that someone is going to misuse it with the intent. And same thing with security, that the misuse will only come if someone kind of breaches with that intent. So it's maybe something to think about, is where is the biggest influence we have in 2021 to actually steer some of these more complex questions.
Okay, and on that note, I just want to thank everyone that was on the panel today. It's a big, meaty set of topics. I think any one of these could have been a day-long discussion, and essentially we have an entire conference covering them. So thank you very much. I think it was an enjoyable and stimulating conversation. Zenzele, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Nyari and the team. Thank you, Ansgar, Lavina, Paul, Anand. Thank you so much. It's been a very interesting discussion there, a very thought-provoking. Indeed, we need to, take consideration of all these issues while we, adopting these technologies. Thank you to the attendees who have joined our first session today. We have our second session happening tomorrow. So please join us, at the same time. You can use the same link that you used today. We have got exciting, discussions lined up. We're going to look at some AI use cases from different perspectives. I think there's going to be a lot of talk around financial services, and I think there's been a lot of mentioning around the importance of ethics within that space. There's a lot of data that is being used and decisions are being, made. The Paul was talking about how they operate in different, jurisdictions and using the data and all that. So I think we're going to continue with the conversation from looking at the practical application side of things in terms of how AI is being used to make, decisions or to help us in terms of improving competitiveness and so on. Of course, it's very important that we consider ethics. Like Anand, you're saying that, the brakes will help us to, I don't know whether they help us to accelerate or they help us to continue going. But then thank you so much. It's been a great day. Thank you to the sponsors, JUMO, Ecosystem.ai, Fairtech Learning Machines, Darktrace, Light Blue, and Freshworks. We really appreciate that you have made this conference possible. Let's meet again tomorrow at the same time. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, before we can meet at the lounge, those who still want us to continue with the conversation, there are tables on the networking lounge. We can still continue with the conversation if you want, if you've got questions. I think we can still engage further. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.